Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today, I am here with Andrew Getraer, a seasoned Jewish professional. He was the executive director of Rutgers Hillel for 20 years, the managing director of Harvard Hillel for a year, and has worked on a bunch of Jewish projects really over the last couple of decades. So, Andrew, welcome.
Great to be here, Daniel. Great to see you. Mazel tov on becoming a daddy.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is the first podcast since having a kid. It's good. I already have my fifth cup of coffee here, and it's we're recording at about noon California time, so I'm right around the halfway mark for coffee for the day.
I never drank coffee in my life until I had kids.
Got it. It's also impressive because from what I know about you, and just to give listeners a little bit of background, Andrew, you're both one of the people who had been working for Hillel the longest out of anyone I knew, which we're definitely going to talk about the history of Jews on campus. But also you are surprisingly a night owl. And so you consistently will answer texts and emails at about 3 a.m. So it's very impressive you do that without coffee.
Yeah, but don't get a conference call with me at 8 a.m. The 7
Very
a.m.
fair.
breakfast meeting, not my favorite.
Amazing. Well, it's good that I'm on the West Coast anyway, so I give you a 3-hour buffer every time we talk. Okay, so you have been paying attention to Jewish life on campus for at least 20 plus years. I imagine much longer. What have been the most salient differences? Like, let's do the bird's eye view first. And how have Jewish life changed for somebody in the 90s? If you looked at what was going on campus, both in terms of the general campuses and then also in terms of what the Jewish community were doing. I mean, what would you say are the biggest differences? Obviously now, post October 7th.
Well, the college campus in America, the experience there mirrors the experience of Jews generally. I was in college myself in the 80s, the late 80s, and then began working in the 2000s, was following things up and throughout the 90s. The Jewish community has changed, right? The understanding of young Jews about their relationship to the Jewish people has changed. What affiliation means has changed. What Israel means has changed. All these things have changed. And the college campus mirrors that very directly because the college campus is the most shared experience of American Jews, period. Right? The statistics that Hillel has come up with over the years show us that more American Jews go to college than light Hanukkah candles, have a Passover Seder, observe Shabbat, have visited Israel, anything. So the American experience and the American Jewish college experience are almost inseparable. And so the dissolution of institutional Judaism, right, it has also occurred on the college campus, or the students bring to that no expectation that they are affiliated with an institution or will be in their lives. The rise of anti-Semitism, of anti-Zionism, clearly, which I began to see even in the late 80s, and has been a major factor really since the mid or late 90s.
And how much blame do you? I mean,
really,
I guess I'll ask a little bit more pointed because I know we've
yeah.
had a lot of these conversations in the past. When you think about, I mean, obviously Hillel, has been around for 100 years, just to sort of recap the history. It's probably been around in its current iteration really for, 30, 40 years, as big as it is today. But, was this what could Hillel have done better? What could the Jewish organizational world done better to prevent what's currently going on campus? Is this just sort of totally out of our control and it's this sort of strange abomination that arose in terms of campus anti-Semitism and it sort of shocked everybody? Is this a bug of liberalism? Is this a feature of liberalism? Like, unpack to us what's happening. Because I'm going to guess if somebody asked you, in 2001 when you first took over at Rutgers Hillel, you probably, you'll tell me if you disagree, but you probably wouldn't have been able to predict, what's been happening the last 18 months on campus. So is that, just a lack of foresight? Like, what exactly happened there?
The American Jewish community had its head in the sand for a very, very long time, and failed to respond to these issues when they did arise. And they did arise in the early 2000s. My second week on campus was 9/11. Okay. And in that week, two things happened that I think showed what the direction things were going in. One, besides the destruction, which was only a few miles from our campus in New Brunswick, New Jersey, the college newspaper, the Daily Targum, ran a front page opinion piece saying that the Zionist state should be dismantled. Okay, that's a clue when a major state university with the largest Jewish population in the country has got that on its front page. The second thing was that it's a story I've told numerous times, but the 2 days after 9/11, the Muslim Student Association on campus had an open meeting, and they put flyers everywhere, and they came into Hillel. Can we put this flyer up? We said, sure, inviting everyone to a Muslim Student Association meeting to discuss what had just happened. Twin Towers, the whole thing. And I went because I figured, I thought the whole campus would be there. How fascinating would it be to find out what the Muslim camp community is going to say about this? I was, as far as I could tell, the only non-Muslim who was there. And I was standing there with my kippah and listening. And a lot of the things that have occurred since then were I heard in this discussion. There was a denial that Muslims could commit atrocities. A Muslim professor gave a very long talk about Algeria and the horrors and atrocities that occurred in their civil war as an introduction to, yes, Muslims can do bad things sometimes, which was news to a lot of the people there, and including me, that there's different approaches to reality in different communities. What happened in Algeria was not a surprise to me that Muslims did this. It was just a fact. It was a big surprise to people in that room. The next thing that happened was after he spoke, and there was an imam who spoke from a local mosque, and he answered questions. First question: how do we tell people that the Israelis did this? That's the first question. And all eyes in the room sort of go to me, standing there with my kippah, and I'm just like staring straight ahead at the imam, like, how's he going to answer this one? And he took a pause and he said, it's too soon to talk about the political dimension. And everyone in the room went like, oh, okay. And I'm standing there thinking, did I just hear this? Like, Israel did, as far as the 250 people in that room are concerned, Israel did this, but we can't say it yet. Now, to go back to your question, is what's happened in the last 18 months a surprise? When a campus newspaper in 2001 is calling for the dismantling of the state of Israel, and one of the largest Jewish Muslim student associations in the country at that time, and still, I think, allows that discussion to occur without question, that Israel is responsible for 9/11. The clues were all there. The tropes were there. Things were already happening. And people didn't want to deal with it. And because of Rutgers was one of the handful of campuses that was sort of on the forefront of this in the early 2000s, I saw it constantly. And when I would raise that with my Hillel colleagues at the International Center or on other campuses, they would look at me like I was from Mars. And when I would raise it with folks at the university administration level, it did not register at all. And so what I saw then was threats to Jews don't register with university administrators, who were very much concerned with threats to other groups. And our major Jewish institutions, what we now call the legacy institutions, also didn't want to deal with it because they didn't want to see it. They didn't want to know that it was real, or they discounted it. I mean, it's very similar to, tragically, how the IDF dealt with Gaza and Hamas before October 7th. It's not really a threat. We can it's like, don't get all worked up about it. And that's a tragic mistake. And I'll tell you one other thing we could have done, which frustrated me for many years. In the early 2000s, Hillel did not do much about Israel on campus. And Chabad, almost nothing. That's a whole other discussion. When I got to Rutgers and Israel was a major issue already, I was like, well, we're putting up an Israeli flag in the lobby and we're a Zionist organization. Like, that's not really a question. Students were shocked because they had been told previously, it's too controversial. This is 2001. It's too controversial. We can't really do Israel stuff. And that was going on all over the country. So that's something we should have known and understood.
So there was just a shying away. I mean, it's interesting. There's so many different things I want to respond, but I'll just take the last thing you
Yeah,
said.
yeah,
So we don't. Yeah, it's very different than the way that I grew up because, I was in, not to highlight too much the age disparity between us, but I recall, 9/11 as a second grader and just being very confused about what happened. But separately, I mean, I went to a very Zionist Jewish day school. I had a very Zionist community. I grew up in the modern Orthodox community. So for us, Israel was front and center to everything. It wasn't separate than our Jewish identity. I mean, this is something that I think is so difficult, even for liberal Jews, to understand that they see almost Israel programming as a separate facet of programming. Then you might have your weekly Parsha class or your social or your, Shabbat dinner. And then there's also like an Israel thing. For us in, middle school and high school, I mean, there was virtually no difference, by any extent. And so on the flip side, I mean, I think, there's a fear, but there's also just the problem is Judaism and Israel requires a ton of background knowledge. I mean, as Jews, we don't like to make anything simple. So we have such a storied history. There's such a complexity when it comes to understanding who we are, what our history is, what our definition is, where does Israel fit in, where does anti-Zionism, where does anti-Semitism fit in? And people who sort of like speak Jewish and are familiar with the Jewish community, they get it. But the problem is that I fear, and this is something that I've seen a lot, and I haven't complained about this as much on the podcast, but I know we've had these conversations. A lot of liberal Jewish institutions are quite frankly run by people who actually don't know that much about Judaism in Israel. So it actually might not be a situation of, oh, we don't want to touch this because it's too controversial. But just like you're not going to have a lot of liberal Jewish communities that are going to have high-level Talmud classes because it's quite possible that a lot of their educators have never actually struggled and delved into a piece of Talmud. It might also be the same way that like this wider understanding of like Jewish peoplehood and Israel and Zionism or where that fits in, this stuff is just too complicated. So it's a lot easier to focus on, what's the easy things to focus on? Tzedakah, chesed, tikkun olam, right? Again, these topics that are, again, hugely important. I don't want to discount it, but those almost took over, not because I think, that's all that Judaism means to certain liberal Jews, but I think it's just a lot easier than having to delve into the complexity.
Well, I think you're right. It's easier than dealing with the complexity, but it's also easier because the American Jewish community is the most massively ignorant, voluntarily ignorant Jewish community maybe in history, right? The Soviet Jews were prevented from learning about and practicing Judaism. American Jews have prevented ourselves from learning about and practicing Judaism. And not like only Orthodoxy, but across the spectrum of Jewish practice, ignorance is the rule. And if you ask the changes that I saw over my career, increased ignorance of anything was just one of those dynamics which has characterized the Jewish community over the years.
Let's dig in. Sorry, I'm going to cut you off in a second. Can we dig in? What do you mean by the purposeful ignorance, right? I mean, right, if I was going to diagnose it, I would just say in the last 30 years, there's just a lot of competition. So, for a lot of liberal Jews, the opportunity cost of really understanding what the Talmud is comes at the cost of Netflix and going to the beach and hanging out with friends and scrolling on Instagram. So what do you know? Most Jews have no familiarity with the Talmud, which of course is the most central work in Judaism, for history. But I don't know if it's a purposeful, like, I don't want to know about this. I think it's just, again, in the sort of like open marketplace, we haven't, and, we can place the blame a little bit on us. We haven't been able to yet make the convincing argument that like, hey, this is worth your time at a level that is more than, binging your latest Netflix series.
The voluntary ignorance of the American Jewish community predates Netflix by a couple of generations, right? The American Jews came to America and for the first time were able to really integrate into a modern liberal society, right? The Europe, which opened up after Napoleon with citizenship and rights, etc., had proven to be a failure, which is why a lot of Jews ended up in America. They were getting killed there. And ultimately, that's what Europe did to its Jewish community. But America, what a wide open, incredible, free, beautiful space to be in. And so Jews voluntarily stopped practicing Judaism, living in Jewish communities, educating themselves as Jews because America had so many other things to do. So you're right in that, yes, the competition for time, effort, etc., was one of the factors which made Jews choose other things. But it goes back very, very deeply. My own great grandparents came here. They're very religious people. Their kids, well, not so religious. Their kids, not religious at all. In my generation, among, like, say, me and my cousins, some of them are of like no Jewish education, and like maybe they're proud to be Jews. I think they are, but they're not actively involved in a lot of Jewish things. I happen to sort of return, as they say, and I became a Baal Tshuva personally. So my kids were raised more in schools like you were, where that Zionism, Judaism are all of one piece. But most of the American Jewish community didn't make those choices. Most of the American Jewish community has drifted away from the centrality of Jewish identity since they got off the boat at Ellis Island. And that's voluntary to me. I'm not saying.
Well, there is a little bit of a selection bias. It's only interesting. I'm going to nerd out with you for 1 second here, and the listeners, maybe will appreciate this, or maybe you can just fast forward the next 2 seconds of annoying history here. America was deemed the sort of Treifa Medina, right? The, non-kosher state by a lot of major European rabbis in the late 1800s, especially during that immigration that, I also, most of my family came between the 1880s and World War I, which is when the vast majority of Ashkenazi Jews got here. I think it was 2 million over the course of 25 years. And or 35 years. And a lot of them specifically came, right? The selection bias was the ones who came to America were doing it explicitly against the wishes of a lot of the rabbinic leadership. So it was almost like, a lot of them got to Ellis Island, and for the first time they were allowed to, just slip off the kippah and, just sort of inconspicuously, blend in. It's actually funny. It's always what I say about California Jews, because everyone notices that, California Jews are always one level less traditional than New York, right? So you say, conservative
Only
Judaism on the
west.
one level, maybe 1.5, right? But you'll say like conservative Judaism on the West Coast, is similar to, Reform Judaism on the East Coast, and like that, modern Orthodoxy on the West Coast is like conservative on the East Coast. So it's almost a similar selection bias of, California was considered this, empty frontier, adventurous. So the people who came in the 1800s, they probably weren't the ones who cared the most about, where am I going to have a synagogue to pray, the evening services. So there is a little bit of an interesting history there.
There is. And of course, the Haredi and Hasidic communities that stayed in Europe and forbid their people to leave. We know what happened to those communities. And so there's a selection bias in overall among the Jewish people. But a lot of Jews who came to America were very traditional, right? The way that traditional Israelis might be. Like, maybe they weren't the most learned people in the world, but they kept kosher, they kept Shabbat, they only married Jews. That was just their thing, because that's how Jews had lived for a couple thousand years. And America gave them the opportunity to do other things. It also forced them. I mean, how many people gave up observance of Shabbat because that was the only way you could make a living? America didn't have a weekend. America required you to work on Saturday. There are a lot of reasons why American Jewry became less Jewish, but I categorize them as voluntary because there were those who chose, no, actually, this is important. You had the choice to make. If you were a Jew in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, they were telling you pretty forcefully you did not have the choice, and they erased Jewish tradition, and they erased Jewish education and observance for 70 years. That was involuntary. America, happily voluntary, but no less ignorant. And that when the product of multiple generations of that arrives on campus, no matter how smart they are, no matter what great kids they are, no matter how much they feel proud to be Jewish, many of them don't have an inkling as to what being Jewish has meant to the Jewish people historically, or even to their grandparents. It doesn't mean a whole lot. For some, it means nothing, and for some, it just, we know what the reports all say. It's a kind of a sense of humor. It's a caring about social justice, things which Jews are like, that do characterize a lot of Jews, but it doesn't. It's not specifically a Jewish thing or defining trait in historically in the Jewish community. So you get
there are a couple.
Talmud, they know no Zionism, they know nothing.
Yeah, no, that is definitely the norm rather than the exception of people who grow on the campus. Even those, just to highlight that have strong Jewish identities, having never heard of the Gemara before, which, or the Mishnah before, maybe vaguely have heard it. So there are a couple of demographic predictions that, depending on if I have a more optimistic or pessimistic day, is, how I view these. I mean, you have some, there was sort of the famous speech by Carolyn Glick, who's an Israeli, opinion, columnist. This was a couple years ago already, who
And
basically,
now a direct advisor to Netanyahu as of
and
a
now a
couple.
direct advisor to Netanyahu. Yeah. And she basically was at a speech saying, American liberal Jews, it doesn't matter that they're becoming more anti-Zionist because in 2 generations they're all going to basically have disappeared, just because of some mix of intermarriage, assimilation, and also just lack of knowledge and just an identity being so thin as to it not being seen as Jewish. Now, one of the interesting, just I don't know if this is necessarily a caveat, but I'm teaching a class on American Jewish history now, and I was reading all these op-eds from the late 1800s in America, written by Reform Jewish leaders that were basically predicting the same thing about Orthodox. So they were saying, by
They're
the
going to
20th century,
disappear.
there's going to be no Orthodox Jews. So I'm a little bit wary, but when you do look at the statistics, I mean, it does seem like there's a solid demographic argument to make that in the future it's either going to be Israelis with all the spectrum of Israeli Jewishness, and then Orthodox Jews in America, and then maybe some other vague category of like ethnic Jew by ancestry who, eats lox every, couple of months. But like, I don't know if that's necessarily true, but that's certainly where the trend lines are going. Obviously people like us who have spent our careers or are spending our careers specifically in the liberal Jewish world, trying to reverse that trend in some way of trying to say, hey, not everybody, it's not, and, this is certainly my philosophy. I'd imagine this is yours. It's not, Orthodox or bust. There's a whole range of, thickness in terms of your Jewish identity that like you can and should have as a Jew. So, learning one page of Talmud is better than learning zero, just to have some familiarity with what this is. But it seems like we are very much going against, all betting, predictions here. I am optimistic, but it does seem like we're trying to do something against the demographics. Although I will say, in the last couple of years, even before October 7th, but especially after October 7th, I think there has been a proliferation of Jews that are really strongly trying to rectify this. And the problem is, and I come into this all the time, I'm sure you got this question a lot also, is people that genuinely are interested and want to know and want that thickness, but they don't have any idea where to start. I mean, how do you start? If you are 21 and you know nothing about Judaism, I mean, I genuinely, I thought about this a lot. I mean, do you start by, maybe just showing up to synagogue? Do you start with Chumash? Do you take an intro to Judaism class at your local synagogue? Do you take a Jewish studies class? I mean, it just seems so hard. And I think this is where a lot of people are at now.
Well, this is one of the real difficulties in the American Jewish community is how to become more knowledgeable or connect. How to connect. We don't have the infrastructure readily available to people to do so. There's a lot of organizations, a lot of things, but people don't know how to find them, and they don't necessarily succeed. Like the story of the kid who's like, I want to do something, so he goes to a synagogue, stands there bewildered, and then leaves and never returns, and figures, well, like that, I tried. That's it. That's a common story. One of the things that Israel does for liberal Jews and for Jews who do not have a thick identity is it shows them that being Jewish is more than a synagogue. Because in America, because we are part of the whole society, we've carved this little niche of like, where do you go to be Jewish? You go to synagogue on a holiday, or you have a family celebration on a holiday. And those are like the two places that Jews have allowed still some space to connect. And if synagogue isn't the thing, and synagogue is not an easy thing, right? Prayer is a challenge intellectually.
I actually have actively, I don't know if I lose my rabbi credential for this. I guess I'll find out after, but I have actively told people that are in the stage of, thin Jewish identity, but wanting to learn a lot more to not go to shul on
Right.
Yom Kippur. I've never really done anything Jewish, but I'm starting to learn more and I want to connect. I'm looking for, Yom Kippur service. I won't tell them explicitly not to go, but I'll say like, hey, if you want to do this, great. But like, just so like I would, go to a Thursday night, Jewish learning that has, pizza or cholent before you go to this
What
because
you say is so ironic, right? But it's true. It's like saying, I want to get in better shape. I'm going to go run the Boston Marathon tomorrow. Well, that's not a good way to get in shape. That's a good way to never want to run again. And that's like going to Yom Kippur services if that's not part of your life and routine is very similar. You're not going to be able to handle it, understand it, or get any meaning out of it. So good for you in that ironic and strange way that you have some different advice for people. One of the things that I've seen students go to Israel and see is, holy smokes, there are ways to be Jewish that have nothing to do with this narrow way of being Jewish which we have in America, and they're excited by it, right? So the number of students I know who have made Aliyah is pretty significant, and they tend to fall into two categories. The modern Orthodox kid who's been raised with Zionism and love of Israel, and that's like the homeland, and they want to return. And the student who has not been raised with much Judaism, but has been exposed to Israel, is like, wow, I can be myself and feel like a fulfilled Jew. And those are real, that's a real thing. We in America, we haven't really figured out how to make people feel like fulfilled, meaningful Jews outside of some very narrow set of experiences that are really not for everybody. Hillel tries to do that, right? With a whole myriad of different ways of being Jewish, etc. But on the whole, it's a very, very difficult thing to do.
Yeah, this is entirely, you're just summarizing. I don't know if you mean to do this, but you're summarizing Ahad Am's essay in defense of Zionism. I mean, it's
Right.
exactly what he says. And he's observing this in the 1880s in Europe, where he's saying, hey, Jewish identity here is so thin because everybody's trying their best to be a Frenchman or a German or, an Austrian or an American. And so, culturally, we're all American. And yet I think he has this one line that says, they've reduced Judaism to some shallow creed-based religious tradition that nobody believes in anyway. So like, that's exactly, I read that and it's
Right.
such a powerful essay because, if you go the route of the mainstream American Jewish community, AKA the Reform movement, that was always the most dominant movement here, right? Starting from the 1820s, it was the most dominant movement,
The
the Reform
conservative
movement.
movement had a pretty good run in the 60s and
It
70s.
you're right, fair.
But yes, the
But
reform
right,
movement was the founding American movement.
the flagship, right? The 1880s, the Pittsburgh platform, Judaism is not a nation. We don't want to return to Zion. We are a religion, right? If you sort of take that to its extreme, the problem is you pull a lot of Reformed Jews and they're agnostic about their beliefs. So like, okay, you've changed Judaism from this interesting nation civilizational, thing that's super thick and super rich, and you've reduced it to a religion like Protestantism. Okay, great, but you've done it. Okay, but then you say you don't even believe in the dominant creeds. So where do you even go from there, right? It's oftentimes almost bewildering, and then that's exactly, I think you're right, where Zionism is fit in. Now the problem, and where we can move to, unless you have something to add to that, that Zionism has gone from, and we've all heard this before, the greatest unifier of American Jews of okay, here you can at least have even if you don't go to synagogue in Yom Kippur, even if you're agnostic about what you believe, even blah blah blah, you can at least participate in this nation state project and go on birthright and all these things. And now that's almost becoming not the case because to fit into good progressive circles, you're not really allowed to do that anymore. So I'm curious how you think about that. Like, does that mean that the liberal Jewish community is kind of just stuck because their one saving grace of, well, at least we'll all be connected to this. A lot of liberal Jews now, okay, some small percentage are explicitly saying, okay, we're anti-Zionist, but some larger percentage, I suspect, are just shying away. I mean, we've definitely had people on campus. And again, I want to say, Hillel's, we basically doubled in terms of, number of students attending to all events post October 7th. I think that's pretty consistent across the board. But I certainly know that there have been students that are not coming, not because they are uncomfortable with Israel or Zionism, but because they're in friend groups and they just don't want to deal with it. And, the number of students I meet every week that have explicitly lost their other friend groups or access to their clubs or sports teams or, whatever, is crazy. And so, now there is being a choice, a forced choice for liberal American Jews, ones that, quite frankly, to the Orthodox community in neither cases, it doesn't hurt in either way, because most Orthodox Jews don't really care about being accepted in the, liberal clubs, and, no Orthodox Jew is going to lose sleep not being invited to the LGBTQ, barbecue that's happening next weekend. And also, I think Orthodox Jews have generally been, more connected to Israel because of the religious elements. But for liberal Jews, exactly where we sit, right? Like with Hillel, it almost seems like something is stuck unless there's some big change. We can keep riding this wave of post October 7th. There's a lot of anti-Semitism, so a lot more Jews are taking refuge. But like, what happens in 2 years when things generally get back to normal but are slightly worse, than they were pre-October 7th, but like normal enough that like you don't have to run to your local Jewish community, every week because something terrible is on campus. Like, is this just going to be another 20, 25 years? Like when I'm being interviewed as somebody, I don't know if I'll work for Hillel for as long as you did, but like if I'm on someone's podcast and they're asking me, what do you think about the last 25 years of campus life? Am I just going to be saying the same things that you're saying?
What you're talking about is the complete failure of liberal Judaism to create a continuity of peoplehood and subjugating itself to its political values and its social relationships. And this is a real tragedy for America and American Jews. I think it I don't think it can be reversed entirely, but there can be some change. A lot of my even most liberal Jewish friends are shocked by what's happened in the last year and a half, not in Gaza, but in their school, in their workplace, in their synagogue, where the betrayal of people they thought were their allies has been fairly complete. The betrayal by feminist groups of Jewish women, right? The people who marched for everybody else and then no one will march for them. That tragedy has left a lot of liberal Jews feeling like maybe I don't have a home where I thought I did, and I have to either create a new one of other liberals who actually but still value Jews and difference and that community, or I have to leave my liberalism. I think there's going to be a significant portion who do that, but then there's going to be a lot of folks who are left behind and lost, which is really terrible because their Jewish identity is not thick enough to withstand the slings and arrows of outrageous liberal American fortune. It's going to be a serious loss for us. Now, you talked about the demographic predictions for the future, which nobody knows what will happen tomorrow. But the liberal American Jewish community is not going to disappear, as some people on the right think, because it's the largest community in America, and they're going to keep living. And so, but what we're going to have, I think, over the next 70 to 100 years in America, assuming that Mashiach doesn't come and we don't all move to Israel, is a much deeper divide than we have even now, of people who identify as Jews but have no Jewish content in their lives, or very, very minimal, but who are lobbying and acting politically as Jews in the name of the Jewish people, and a much larger Orthodox community, because demographically that's a growing community, on the opposite end of the social and political spectrum, and a complete loss of the middle, which is none of this is good for anybody. But if you start predicting the future, you're going to make terrible, terrible mistakes.
Very fair. No, it is. I mean, sadly already, I mean, I sort of have one foot in the Orthodox community and one foot in the liberal Jewish community. And there's already such a stark bifurcation, even just in terms of like Jewish identity, right? I mean, the number of people in an average liberal Jewish community that are either patrilineal Jews or non-Orthodox converts or the children of non-Orthodox converts, is a very high percentage, especially in California. New Jersey might be a little bit more, you might be lagging 40 or 50 years behind in terms of that trend. But, on campus, or if you go to one of the liberal synagogues here, the number of people that fit that camp, it's around, I don't want to give exact predictions, but I wouldn't be surprised if somebody or made a compelling argument that it was almost 50%. And the Orthodox communities kind of view towards that isn't antagonistic. It's just sort of like one of irrelevance. That's like, okay, they can do that, but that has nothing to do with like what we're doing, which is quote unquote real Judaism. And I spend my whole life in this weird situation because I'm constantly trying to like socially, intellectually, programmatically, like bridge these two groups that, both have very little knowledge of each other, have very little desire to have knowledge of each other. And three, the only thing they know about each other are, some very shallow stereotypes that sometimes have some truth and sometimes don't have some truth. And, it's always just very interesting to be here, but it kind of seems like, again, those trends are continuing. And again, Israel is almost such a great solution to that. It's so funny because people who struggle with these questions of Jewish identity and all of this, a lot of times they go to Israel and a lot of those questions just sort of get, wiped away. Israel obviously has other problems when it comes to, Jewish identity and things like that, but it's a whole other category. But again, what you were talking about before, the sort of, thinness of Jewish identity outside of Orthodox community doesn't exist in Israel. And so, but a lot of people in America just feel stuck because they're not willing to make these sort of lifestyle commitments of
Right.
that Orthodox Judaism entails, but they also are, they want more depth than, again, the average liberal institution is able to provide. I mean, I even see this with Hillel. I mean, the way in which Hillel is run, both our Hillel and also just from what I know about all other Hillels, and this isn't saying anything bad. I think, we, do generally a good job, and, I spend most of my time thinking about it. But if I was a college student, I would not have appreciated the types of programs that the Hillel that I run are doing. It just wouldn't have been enough. And it's not to say anything about good or bad. It's just, in your sports analogy, I don't love your running analogy, but I think it's okay. So let's stick with it. Because I don't
Okay.
think it's just a spectrum from like terrible shape to in shape. I think there probably are a little bit of other, gray areas there. But if I'm coming into college, having run marathons, I don't need to go on a fast walk around the neighborhood to get in shape, right? So I oftentimes feel like that's the problem. And so every once in a while we do get students, I now have a weekly, Gemara Chavruta with, an incoming freshman who's actually from Israel. It's his first year here. He grew up religious in Israel. And, he came to a couple of, other Jewish learning events. And then he came to me and he was shocked. And he said, oh, I thought Parsha and Pizza was going to be, like an Orthodox shiur on Parsha and Pizza, which would probably, you'd analyze a couple of Pasukim and you'd probably learn, at least two or three, ancient, Talmudic sources, Midrashic sources, and then you'd see three or four, medieval sources. And really this was me explaining in the most general terms, oh, who is Aaron again? Oh yeah, Aaron is Moshe's, brother. Oh, what did he do? It's very much that. And so afterwards he was like, is there any chance that we can have, a chavruta? And so that's been great. But like from his vantage point, it's almost impossible. Like, how do you even start to bridge these two communities? And that's an easy case. That's not a case when anyone's identity is at risk. That's just you have limited bandwidth. You have 1 hour to teach, okay, if 12 students are coming and they've never heard of, who Aaron was, that's a lot more important to cover than what the Rashbam says about this, interesting pasuk for this one guy who maybe, it's necessary for.
You, with your particular background, you're straddling multiple worlds more than most, because in my experience, most Hillels, most college campuses are fairly homogeneous in the types of Jews that they have on their particular campus. The place where there's a lot of knowledgeable, day school educated Jews, that's like 3 dozen campuses in America, right? And then there's 120 campuses with the rest of the Jews who are basically just like your generic American, not need to be told who Aaron was, right? And that's who we cater to, generally speaking. But it's not enough, and it's not even enough for those kids, because once they figure out who Aaron was, how do they move ahead? How do they keep learning? Most campuses don't have the resources to facilitate that continued growth. And, frankly, the Hillel professionals don't have the knowledge because they're not trained to do that. Some are. There's some of the most brilliant educators I've ever known have worked at Hillel, but most campuses are not, because that's not what you need to serve the needs of that introductory kind of a kid. Hillel's commitment to pluralism, which is one of the defining characteristics, tends to not include the most religious or the most educated people, just because they're the minority and you can't cater to the minority. And that's a real issue for the kid who comes to you and wants a real parsha shiur. But it's
Although
also
I will say this is also a problem with general education. So I've also been, lecturing for a couple years on campus, and obviously I teach Jewish studies, but even in courses that, the intellectual understanding of the content has nothing specifically to do with Jewish studies. I'm teaching a medieval Jewish thought class now, and so we've read, some excerpts from Aristotle and Plato and Plotinus and a lot of the Greek thinkers, and it's very clear that there's about 10 to 15% of people who like really get it, and for them the class slides are like they got it the first time, so I don't need to review it 8 times and have a almost spark note-esque type article for them to read. They can actually start reading some more of the scholarly debates. But for 80% of the students, they kind of need the like, okay, for the fifth time.
What you're showing, this isn't there's a Jewish context for this problem, but it's not a specifically Jewish problem. It's an education problem, and you see it in second grade, right? When people start to differentiate in their scholastic abilities and curiosity, et cetera. So it's an educational problem across the spectrum. There is a particular Jewish context to it, though, because the students who come with less knowledge are going to obviously need a whole different world of things. Years ago, people from Israel came to a meeting we had in New Jersey to promote the new Masa program. They were going to put all 50 million bucks, I think it was at the time, into programs for students who graduate college so they can go to graduate school or do things like that in Israel. And what did we think of it? And what they wanted was for us to say, yay, rah, rah, thank you for the resources. And I said, this is the stupidest plan I've ever heard. You're putting all your money in the wrong place. If we want to create educated, caring Jews, take your $50 million and put it at the other end of the pipeline. Put it into day schools, put it into youth programs, summer camps, so that when they get out of college, they don't need a scholarship. They're going to like demand greater Jewish opportunities. And we've never been good at that as a community.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So taking, I guess, a big step back, I mean, how would you start to think about, I mean, this problem and even solving it? Because whether you're giving practical advice to individuals that might, I'd imagine a lot of people listening to this podcast, again, there's probably also a little bit of a selection bias there of people that are choosing to consistently listen to a Jewish podcast, but people that are in that position of like they're coming to even Hillel or other synagogues, but they've started to feel like it's not really enough for them, but they don't want to make the jump into Orthodoxy because it comes with a whole bunch of social and dogmatic things that maybe they're uncomfortable with. I mean, it is a shame that, especially on the West Coast, I'd imagine, you have it a little bit easier on the East Coast because, you do have a lot of organizations that are filling in the wider spectrum than exists on the West Coast, where, the choices really are like liberal Jewish community and Orthodox. But I don't know, I'm curious if you have any
it's really tough. And even in New Jersey, which has much stronger affiliations numbers than most of the rest of the country, the conservative movement has declined considerably. Schools have closed, synagogues are smaller, and the plethora of organizations that do Jewish education that have grown over the last 20 years tend to be more on the traditional kiruv side. There's a lot of that, and that's good because they're serving a niche, and there are people who are gravitating to that. But it's not going to be for everybody, obviously. I'm not sanguine about liberal Judaism's ability to get through this moment. I think it's Rabbi Hirsch Amiel, right? Great reform voice for Zionism, who has really been fairly outspoken about the failure of the reform movement to educate its people to value Jewish peoplehood and to value Zionism and to value commitment and even obligation, which is not.
But it's funny because this was, I mean, obviously the reform movement updated its platform either in the late 20s or the 1930s, one of the listeners can check. But the original reform movement, both in Germany and in America, that was a feature, not a bug, right? Like they were explicitly, it's funny because just earlier today, and my class is mostly, I apologize, I have a little dog barking in the background here. She's has very opinionated also about the American reform movement. I was presenting this to mostly non-Jewish students today. Give me actually 2 seconds. Let me
Yeah.
just I'll pause this. There.
Gotta love dogs.
Are you a dog person, Andrew? I'll cut this part out.
Love dogs. We have a beautiful dog, Tucker, who's lying on the couch, chilling out. Makes our lives better.
It definitely does. All right, cut till this.
Okay.
Yeah, no, and it's fascinating because this is literally a feature of the reform movement, both in Germany and America. Not a bug. Obviously, it's updated since, but so earlier today, literally like 2 hours ago, I was talking about post-Civil War American Jewish community with a class, mostly non-Jews. And they were reviewing the Pittsburgh platform, and they, at least if they were paying attention, they understand all the historical and political implications that's going on in all of this, blah, blah, blah. And so I asked them to, remark on, the fifth pillar of the Pittsburgh platform, that we are no longer a nation, we are a religious community, we don't expect to return to Palestine, neither a temple, blah, blah, blah. And, a non-Jewish girl in the front raises her hand, and I was like, what is going on here? And she said, this seems like a document explicitly trying to distance the American Reform Jewish community from the rest of the Jewish world. And I had never really thought of it like that, because usually we think of it as, oh, they were trying to describe Judaism in more Protestant terms, so it would be more palatable and understandable for, American and German Protestants. But, by saying Judaism is not a nation or a religion, it essentially allowed the American Reform movement to say, like, we don't have any like national, the sort of question, am I my brother's keeper? They would say, well, we're not brothers, right? Like, we're not a nation. We happen to share similar creeds, but who cares, right? Like, to some extent, who cares if we share creeds? Because again, most Reform Jews aren't even that strong in their conviction for these creeds. So, that was what the Reform movement, I mean, again, the Reform movement have certainly updated. No Reform rabbi today would, open up the Pittsburgh platform, and, read it in synagogue as their 10 commandments. But like, that was almost how it was set up. Like, the Reform movement started off in such a major hole because they were so wrong about all of these questions. I mean, literally every sociological question about Judaism in the last 150 years, the earlier Reform movement got wrong, right? Like, even today, I mean, the success of Kiruv organizations, just to define that for listeners, Kiruv literally means, to come close, but it's sort of, it's generally an Orthodox term to bring people back into a more traditional practice. Chabad would be considered, a Kiruv organization. The success of Chabad shows that, it's not shallow identity that people want. It's deep identity. And, the other thing that's happened in the liberal Jewish community that I suspect is connected to this is because there is this desire for a little bit of tradition and somebody knowing what's going on and, so somebody in charge, right? Like, authority and things like that. There is actually more of a deference to leadership than there is in the Orthodox community. So one of the funniest things that I think, about Jewish sociological life that I always like to remark on is, again, I grew up in the modern Orthodox community, with, listeners may or may not be aware, and we respected our rabbis, don't get me wrong, but like, the authority of the rabbi past narrow questions of Jewish law basically had no like, of this, authority and blah, blah, blah. And like, because everybody kind of knew everything. So like, you didn't need the rabbi to read the Torah on Shabbat. You didn't need the rabbi to lead services. You didn't need the rabbi to, do any number of other things, and I've actually been, I always love to tell students, like, you actually don't need rabbis in Judaism. Like, there's no Jewish legal, there's no halachic difference. I know you know this, but just to spell it out for listeners, like, there's nothing in Judaism you need a rabbi for in 2025. Like, you don't need a rabbi to officiate a wedding, a funeral. The rabbi doesn't bless food to make it kosher. Like, rabbis are almost this sort of made up title that just means, teacher, now in Judaism. But in the liberal Jewish community, rabbis are like the, wealth of Jewish knowledge and the be all end all. And like, there are liberal Jewish communities that if there's no rabbi there on Shabbat, there just won't be services because who knows how to, everything's so foreign. And
because
meanwhile,
in a odd sense, the rabbi in a liberal congregation is the designated Jew.
100%.
Right. A few years ago, I saw I forget what his name was, the president of the OU at the time, the Orthodox Union, came to speak at Rutgers, and he gave a fascinating talk, which really stuck with me, that speaks to possibly the future of some of the liberal Jewish community in America, but also like sociologically to what American Jews are really all about. And he said, if you look back and historically, most American Jews were Reform, and then most American Jews were conservative. And in the 50s, 60s, 70s, into the 80s, the conservative movement was the most prominent of the movements. And what American Jews are looking for is a community that can feel attached to other Jews and proud with other Jews and mourn with other Jews and celebrate with other Jews and feel, and that will do the Jewy things with them, like the holidays, and they'll keep kosher to some extent, or they'll go and get their little kosher fix, even if they're eating their Chinese food on the patio or whatever thing that they did in their personal lives. But the mass of Jews don't want to take on Orthodox practices. They don't want to take on traditional halakhic Jewish law obligations, but they want to be part of a community that is in the air. And he made a great observation, which is that the success of Chabad in America today comes almost entirely at the expense of conservative and reform synagogues, where that's who they're polling. They're not getting their membership out of the Orthodox community, and their membership from the totally non-affiliated community those are people who used to be members of conservative or reform synagogues, or who in a previous generation would have been.
No, you are entirely right. I want to, just stamp that, and highlight it and bold it, because
the thing that I just thought was brilliant about this observation was that American Jews want somebody who's going to be up front as the designated Jew. And that Chabad rabbi is great at it. He dresses the part, he talks the part, he's knowledgeable, he's got the great big family and the kids, and they're all super proud to be Jews. And then you can be proud to be a Jew too with them, and you can go and plug into like that warmth of a family and pride of being Jewish, and you'll learn a little Torah maybe if you get motivated to go to one of their classes. But then you can go back home and not do anything Jewish, or be intermarried and assimilated, like whatever it is. But you have that Chabad to plug into, so you feel connected, and it's replaced how people used to feel in the conservative or reform movements. And I think that's really interesting to me, as like, what are the emotional, psychological needs of the non-traditional Jew in America, the non-affiliated Jew in America, that are being served by that? Because it's the fastest growing Jewish movement in the world. And the number of people who praise it on a daily basis, I'm just shocked all the time by like who is now connected to a Chabad. And when you say, well, where should somebody go who like doesn't know what to do? That is an organization that is actually trying to serve those people's needs.
No,
I've got other issues with Chabad, right? That's not like a perfect institution, but sociologically, it's found a niche that is really vital.
I've done a 180 on like a total 180. I mean, growing up, this is another time when I think just some background for listeners is important. The modern Orthodox community and Chabad is sort of a natural rivalry, not in terms of membership, but just in terms of disparate views of traditional Judaism. Going back, if listeners really want to do a deep dive, I've never actually done a podcast on the Hasidic Mitnagdid split. But if you're bored today and you're at home, just Google that split and you can read about it. So the modern Orthodox community is decidedly very mitnagdid, right? Which literally means, against, the adversaries. And Chabad is obviously very Hasidic. So, there's sort of a battle for Judaism's soul that took place, in the 1700s there. Listeners can look into that. So anyway,
among the modern European Jews,
exactly,
right, in the Russian Empire.
So the modern Orthodox community grew up belittling Chabad. I'll say it like that. We used to always joke, what's the closest religion to Judaism? And then we'd say Chabad, and everybody would laugh because, there's a little bit of a discomfort with especially all the stuff about the Rebbe. And, there still is a little bit of confusion there. Is the Rebbe a messianic figure? Just the whole idea of a Hasidic Rebbe or a tzaddik, is sort of confusing to modern Orthodox Jews. But then as I started becoming more affiliated with the liberal Jewish world in the last 10 years, it stopped being Chabad is giving a different version of, orthodoxy. It's almost like, oh my God, if I want, liberal Jews to have any deep awareness of what it's like to engage in traditional Jewish life with traditional Jewish practice, with like real allegiance to halacha and Jewish law, not as like a gimmick, not as like isn't this interesting? We gather, every once in a while and do Havdalah as a community together. But like, no matter what is happening, no matter how inconvenient it is to like still be at home in the summer, Saturday at 8 p.m. because the sun hasn't set, like, just all of the nuances of Jewish life, Chabad really is the best place in most cities. And it's almost a shame from some perspective. It's a shame to admit it because it means the liberal Jewish community has failed. But I think it's important to shout that out because it's almost a challenge, whether implicitly or explicitly, to the liberal Jewish community. But it doesn't seem like people are thinking about this. Like, and I think just the last thing that I'll say, and maybe this can lead us to at least the last topic. I mean, I don't know how long you have, but the last thing that I wanted to talk about is politics and American Jews. Many liberal institutions and rabbis have sort of here's my diagnosis. It's not a very favorable diagnosis, but I'm curious if you agree. Because Jewish life in some sense is becoming less relevant for a lot of members in the wider liberal Jewish world, because again, what you were talking about is Chabad, being a competitor. Chabad's kind of taken a lot of the more traditional wing of a lot of these liberal synagogues and a lot of liberal institutions. Not all, of course, but if a Chabad opens up right down the street, the people that are sort of more interested in, thick Judaism and learning about, who the Rashbam is and learning about the Talmud, they're probably going to be a Chabad. So you're left with, the people that are going for more cultural and social reasons. A lot of Reform rabbis have gone all in on politics and all in on not just, Tikkun Olam and activism, but like, every single week for the last 10 years talking about why X, Y, or Z Trump policy is bad for, this and goes against Jewish values, and sort of like the epitome of the, the 150 or however many people signed that New York Times letter against Trump's Gaza plan, which of course was never a realistic plan anyway. It was just Trump's, opening bargain or whatever the case is. And this has also alienated some people. I have family who are Reform, but now go to Chabad because they are more conservative and they just felt that they were going to like a pep rally for the Democratic Party every week, not something that's recognizable for synagogue. But I suspect that also has something to do with this shift of almost trying to stay relevant. It's the same thing. It's the last thing I say, and then I would love to hear your thoughts. I've actually heard a lot of humanities professors admit the same thing. So I had a professor at UCI in the humanities. She did not say this. She said to me, I would never say this publicly, but my suspicion is the sort of insane activism of humanities professors becoming, almost anti-capitalist, Marxist, Hamas supporters has obviously some to do with some of the, crazy ideology in the university. But she says, I think a lot of it is almost a social pressure of nobody cares what, literary critics are writing anymore. I mean, when was the last time that you wanted to get a new book that you said, well, who are the English professors saying to read, right? It's like, it's almost a joke to think that there was ever a time in American life where that would be of value. And so to make them more relevant, it's, we're going to go all in on this activism. So it's almost very similar.
They're very similar, and they're failing for similar reasons. The humanities is disappearing on college campuses. They can't get people to go to their classes. Why? Why would you take a class in political activism? You don't need that. A humanities professor, an English professor, should be teaching you why something that Shakespeare wrote is actually relevant across human society in time and space and all these things. That's not what they do. And the failure of liberal Judaism is very similar. You don't need to go to synagogue to have a liberal politics advocacy program, right? You just don't, that you can have that wherever you want to go with actual political allies. And that's what people do. There's no reason to go to synagogue for that. Years ago, they built the new Hillel at University of Florida in Gainesville. And the initial building had in it a sports bar, because the idea was, we put in a sports bar. That's what people like, right? And they'll come and they'll hang out at Hillel and they'll watch sports at Hillel, and we'll be bringing in a whole new cadre of students. And you know what? Nobody went to the Hillel sports bar, because if you need a sports bar, you go to a sports bar. If you want Judaism and you want Jewish content and Jewish community, that's what the synagogues and communities should be delivering. Politics is destroying Jewish identity, not because this politics is right or this politics is wrong, but because Judaism transcends politics. Politics is nothing in the spectrum of Jewish culture and history and identity, and it's a tragedy that that's what's going on. And in looking into like what the future demographics, et cetera, I don't think liberal Jews are going to disappear, not at all. But liberal Judaism is going to disappear, because it almost has already. And what will replace it in that sociological, intellectual, spiritual, and cultural niche of the liberal Jews is not predictable at this moment. Chabad is making its pitch, and they'll do okay. But other things will also fill that niche, and we don't know what they're going to be yet.
Yeah, no, I really love that, and I think I agree with that diagnosis that it's the institutions that are in trouble, not the people. I mean, again, from some perspective, in 2025, there are a higher percentage of American Jews that are engaged in Jewish life than if you go back 100 years ago, certainly 200 years ago. I read a statistic in the 1820s, only 1/3 of American Jews had any affiliation with any synagogue. And again, the 1820s was far before any JCCs or Hillel or any, this was, 100 years before all those institutions. You had a third. I would imagine it's, maybe around that, but maybe even a little bit higher if you consider, Jews that go on high holidays and other things like that. But yes, I think it's the institutions that are in trouble because, again, I think they're failing to pay attention to any of this. I mean, and again, it is really upsetting. And I think, it's funny because we're in a number of group chats together. I won't out any of them in particular, but, I see you complaining about this a lot. I complain about this a lot. And the complaining is more just, observing this and kind of shouting from the rooftops, why is nobody else paying attention to this? But it doesn't seem like anybody else is paying attention. And especially in the liberal Jewish world, Chabad is seen as like some boogeyman that we don't know much about that's somehow just feeding people copious amounts of alcohol to like convince them to go, which is completely the furthest thing from the truth possible. Like the number of times at a Hillel conference, there'll be some conversation and somebody will say that Chabad gets 3 times the amount of students as Hillel, even though Hillel has 3 times the budget and 3 times more staff. And they'll say, oh, it's because Chabad gives wine and we give grape juice. And I'm thinking to myself, like, it's not hard for a 20-year-old college student to obtain wine. Like, I promise you, I can promise you they're not, all getting together and saying, what should we do on Friday night? Shoot, there's this great frat party or there's this amazing Shabbat at Hillel, but like, shoot, they don't give us enough wine or, like, no, it's this rich identity, it's fulfillment, it's all these things that we're talking about. And meanwhile, you go to a lot of Hillels. And again, I love Hillel. I'm working for it. I'll hopefully continue to work for it unless they, one of these days fire me if anybody actually listens to this podcast from Hillel International. But from some perspective, students don't want to come and be told, oh, this Shabbat, we're going to spend the entire time talking about why the repeal of Roe is so terrible. Like, okay, if that's so terrible, we can talk about that. I'm happy to do a Jewish learning class about, Judaism and abortion and why, my personal opinion is I'm upset that Roe was repealed, but fine. That is no place at a Shabbat dinner. Like, in terms of a frontal, programmatic aspect, any less than I'm going to run a Shabbat about how happy or sad I am that the Eagles won the Super Bowl. It's interesting. I watched the Super Bowl, but it's sort of like irrelevant to the wider thing of what we're doing here. But so many people are sort of so all in on this that they're just almost looking for other things to blame. The last thing, it's funny because there was just a big Hillel conference a month and a half ago. And, one conversation that stuck with me, and again, I obviously won't use any names, Hillel and most liberal Jewish institutions are very they're very female dominated in terms of who is, in charge and who's the programmatic staff and even rabbis, among liberal Jews. I think, it's, males are only about like 30% and, then female and, non-binary. And they were remarking on why a lot of Hillels fail to attract a lot of like the more traditional male students, the frat guys and everything like that. And why a lot of them go to Chabad. And now I'm sitting there and, thankfully at UCI, API is very well integrated into Hillel and, I'm good friends with all of them. I'm thinking, it's because once a week I go play basketball with the API guys and I like, in a, loving, but like a guy way, like, I'll push them and like they see that I'm like relatively okay at basketball and I can hang and I can, whatever. And, if I wasn't doing those like traditional guy things and, was just wearing my, I'm a progressive hat and, whatever, they wouldn't come. But at this conversation, everybody was, and I was the only, traditional male, I'll say there. Everybody was saying, some version of toxic masculinity. Oh, it must be the fault of toxic masculinity. It must be the fault of Joe Rogan. It must be the fault of people like Elon Musk that's poisoning their minds, whatever. And like, I was I had this internal monologue of like, do I say something? Do I not? I did say something. I put it in a very gentle way. And, whatever. I don't think it was helpful because they obviously didn't want to hear it, but it's just, I think that the liberal Jewish community, their view of these of Chabad in particular, but the Orthodox world more generally. I think the same thing applies to Aish, and the same thing applies to all these other organizations. It's this like they just don't even know how to approach it because it's so fundamentally different.
It's just foreign to them. But think about what that conversation was. And I've been at tables with the exact same conversation with my colleagues. It's almost like people need to see themselves represented in a space to feel comfortable in that space. And that way of thinking is very well known and understood in Hillel circles, but it's never applied to men, to guys, to the frat brothers, to just like men in general. It's applied to almost every other demographic. It's also very rarely applied to non-Ashkenazi Jews. It's not applied to Mizrahi, Sephardi Jews. It's not applied to Russian.
Why I told you my
American Jews.
my favorite thing that I said at Hillel a couple of years ago. This is my favorite in 8 years of being in these conferences where the sort of de facto view is everybody's a progressive. I finally a year ago at there was a California Hillel retreat where maybe this was 2 years ago, where they were talking about, Ashken normativity and how Hillel is too Ashkenazi and we don't have enough quote unquote Jews of color and all of that. And they were kind of like, we were at a table and people were brainstorming, why do most of the, Persian Jews on the West Coast, I'd imagine on the East Coast, it's more like Syrian Jews, or, just general Israeli Jews, family from Morocco, Tunisia, Iraq, all those places. Why do a lot of them not come to Hillel? And everybody was sort of giving their solutions, which generally, implied move more left wing. And at one point, I said this like half as a joke, but it's true. I was like, what would get the most amount of Mizrahi students? And they're like, what? I was like, if we brought someone like Ben Shapiro to campus, we would never see more non-Ashkenazi Jews than we would that day, because of course, it's the Ashkenazi Jews in America that are all liberal, and I've talked about the Persian community before. Obviously, my wife is Persian. Now my daughter, she's half Persian. So now I can even, I have 2 family members now. It's funny to say, right? You go in that community and it's almost crazy if you didn't vote for Trump. I mean, it's still, I'll still have, conversations. I didn't vote for Trump, and, I'm relatively vocal about my opinions, and like, I'll be treated at Shabbat tables like I've just, made 2 + 2 = 7. They just they can't even fathom how it's possible that somebody, let alone like, oh, I don't know, the modern Orthodox community and, many of my friends there, we're sort of in this situation where like, I don't love either option. I'm going to hold my nose and vote for Trump, or hold my nose and vote for Harris because of these very, careful calculations, maybe Israel and anti-Semitism. For them, it's like, this guy's King Cyrus. Like, what are you, what how are you even thinking twice about this?
Right.
But liberal Jewish institutions have also, in some sense, they've been the worst in terms of Ashken normativity. Growing up in high school, again, this tiny modern Orthodox community in San Diego, I didn't even realize this at the time, how diverse it was. But, I had 6 kids in my high school class. By the time I graduated, it was 5. It was somebody who was French, Yemenite, Moroccan, and somebody from, I'm forgetting, one other North, I don't even remember, because, we were all just like news and bros. I think I was the only person in my class that wasn't, that was just full Ashkenazi, both sides, parents, all the way down, like nothing interesting there. And it's funny because you would never see that, in a lot of other liberal Jewish institutions.
Well, this is one of, I don't want to bash Hillel because I love Hillel. I dedicated a lot of my life to Hillel. And personally, from college on, Hillel changed my life and made me a better Jew. Like straight up. Made me a more committed Jew, et cetera, et cetera. But there are huge blind spots in Hillel, and have been for decades. And one of those blind spots is the fact that everybody who runs Hillel from top to bottom is a liberal progressive Ashkenazi Jew who only has friends who are liberal progressive Ashkenazi Jews and don't understand other kinds of Jews. They're going to be mad at me for saying that if any of them listen to this, and but that's overwhelming.
Well, I'm going to force you to send this around to all them.
There you go.
There
you opened the conversation with what missed opportunities have there been since like 2001 when I started as a infant in Hillel? There have been missed opportunities all along the way, and several of those have been the opportunity to incorporate areas of Jewish life that are not as simple for liberal Ashkenazi Jews. One of which is Zionism, but others of which are Jews from other parts of the world who we, I mean, I'm a 99.9% Ashkenazi Jew, right? Who we didn't even know existed growing up for most of us, like barely on the periphery. Hillel's never been good about incorporating them, appreciating them, understanding them, reaching out to them. We outsource things. You know, when Russian Jews started coming to campus, instead of creating Russian groups in our Hillels or incorporating them into things, although at Rutgers we created a Russian Jewish organization, we sort of outsourced in the New York area and metropolitan area to organizations the Russians created themselves, and that didn't help us understand or relate to one another. And when it comes to Israel was so difficult for Hillel professionals to wrap their hands around, even in the early 2000s, that we outsourced Israel activism. Instead of saying we're a Zionist organization and we own Israel on campus across the spectrum, we outsourced it. That's why J Street on campus became a thing, because Hillel abdicated that space. And that was a disaster. That was a real disaster, because it made Hillel, instead of a place where Israel could help people to be unified or understand each other, it made Hillel a space where we siloed different forms of thinking and outsourced them to external organizations. This is the Stand With Us group. This is the J Street group. Disaster. Total failure. And that's not just at Hillel, it's the American Jewish community as a whole. And we're reaping the—
Yeah, no, it's funny that you said, you don't want to bash Hillel too much. It's funny because if you look at like the stuff that I've published either on Facebook or blog or now podcast, 10 years ago, almost everything I was writing, on my blog was, against the Orthodox community. And that's when I identified as Orthodox. And then once I moved to the liberal Jewish community, almost everything I'm saying is, so it's totally like out of love, it's
You're such a Jew.
Exactly, right?
It's that's what we do. We want to
because
make
when
it better by criticizing it and trying to fix it.
Of course, because you see yourself as a part of a movement, and then you're seeing, people in that movement and leadership in that movement, just having like obvious errors and, whatever. And you're sitting there thinking like, why are you not paying attention to this? Like, this is going to hurt all of us. This is going to make our work harder. It's going to make lives for our students harder. It's going to, set us back. It's going to create more boundaries to allow our students to, fully envelop themselves in Jewish life. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely, in the Talmud, you say, Isurin shel ahava, of afflictions of love here. We've been talking for a long time. I wanted to give you the chance. Is there anything else on your mind? Anything else you're thinking about? Anything else you want to broach?
There are so many things going on for Jews today, right? And I would, there is something if you want to spend a little more time.
Oh, I would love to.
Without going into everything in Israel and the war and Lebanon and Gaza and the Trump plan and what's happening in Jenin today and Iran and Syria and there's like so much going on over there. One of the things which we touched on a little, but I want to dig into more, is that since October 7th, there is many more Jews are trying to get involved in Jewish life, right? Numbers at Hillel's have, in some cases, doubled, right? And many Jewish organizations are seeing people reaching out. They want to connect with their community. And one of the elements of this need to connect with Jewish community after the tragedy of October 7th has been, in some cases, a sort of a new interest in religiosity. The soldiers who are putting on tefillin, the American Jews who are lighting Shabbat candles for the first time, or who are laying tefillin for the first time, or who are, just taking on some ritual or traditional practice. And in the community I come from, and this is applauded. Like, look at like the tragedy, but it's bringing us not only closer, but it's bringing Jews closer to Hashem, closer to God, and wanting to like be a part of the religious aspect of Judaism. There's the reverse aspect also. There are Jews who now are, who since October 7th are hiding a little more because at work they're afraid to be outed, or because their colleagues are voicing this or their companies voice this or that. But the religious challenge that October 7th, from then right until the horrors of what we saw with the Bibas family, they're a challenge to our emunah, to our faith and our belief, if you are a religious person. And I will admit that for me, this has been a struggle that I wasn't expecting, right? And it's not that a challenge, like when bad things happen to good people is an old question, right? And every culture has some answer to it. Judaism's been wrestling with this since Job, at the very least. These are not new questions, but every generation has to wrestle with them for their own particular reason, right? The generation of the Holocaust, we had people who became more religious and people who left religion altogether. I haven't seen much discussion of that since October 7th about the people who are wrestling with their belief or questioning, if not their belief, like what is God's plan? We have the idea of Gamzu Latova, like this too is for the good. God has a plan. It takes time to reveal itself. We can't understand it. What does God tell Job, right? After Job suffers needlessly, his family is killed, all the terrible things. And eventually the answer that God gives Job is, were you there when I created the world? You can't understand, so shut up. And that's a very unsatisfying answer, even as part of me understands that as a person of faith, that is the answer. I haven't seen discussion of that anywhere, and I'm wondering if you've come across this in your West Coast travels.
Honestly, no, not not in the American Jewish sphere. I think, a lot more from what I've read coming out of Israel. I mean, there's been a ton written about even the hostages while they were in Gaza have tried to practice Judaism to an extent that was very shocking. I mean, you have these reports of, this is actually a whole other fascinating question of whether or not one should say, I think Agam Berger, one of the hostages, refused to eat chametz on Passover. That's a really interesting question in general of like, the sort of halachic nerd in me wants to, pull out the Talmud and debate about whether or not that's good or bad. But like in a more general sense, I think there are a lot of stories there. I think you also had that after the Yom Kippur War. You had this sort of, a resurgence of, more traditional Judaism and the Baal Tshuva movement in Israel in general. I don't know. In America, I just, certainly in the Orthodox community, I think I've heard a lot of people talking about it in terms of, there were some beautiful on Tisha B'Av this past year. There was some absolutely heartbreaking and also beautiful keynote, just to define that for listeners, just sort of, poems of lamentation that usually, the traditional ones are either from the Crusades or from the, Spanish Inquisition or something like that. But there's been, again, like are all wrestling with this question that you wrestle with on Tisha B'Av in general, which is, Eicha, right? This question of, why, how was the temple destroyed? How did this happen? How did that happen? And all of that. But no, I don't know. And I'm wondering almost if that's because conversations about God have also become a little bit of a, we don't, because it's uncomfortable. And I'll put the blame on me for this one. I don't shy away from talking about Israel, but it's very rare for me to have a direct conversation about God. And I'll even find myself doing things that later on I'm confused by, where I'll not deflect, but somebody will ask me a question. Let's say you're a student and you're saying, how can God allow this to happen to the Bibas children? And I would say something like, well, it's interesting. There's a debate about this. Maimonides would say this, and other Jewish thinkers would say that, and that's obviously not what the student is looking for. They're not looking for my essay on the poles of Jewish thought in terms of theodicy. They're asking me as somebody who is, again, all the stuff we're talking about before is sort of, the public facing Jewish representative, where I keep clearly, I'm very connected to Judaism and faith and everything like that. How do I answer it? And it is a question that makes me uncomfortable, mostly if I'm being honest with myself, because my answer is I don't know. Like I don't have any, I don't think I actually have any wisdom to bring to the answer to that question than anyone else. And so, but that's something that I think makes me feel uncomfortable. And I'd imagine Kal v'chomer, right? Like even more so to, other various Jewish leaders who may not have even studied what Maimonides thinks about this. So they don't even have that to deflect to of, oh, we have this book Job, we have, Jeremiah's book Eicha, we have Maimonides, we have other, like they're just completely out in the woods and just, we don't know, or, oh, I don't,
And yet I have to think that there is a level at which this question is being felt, even if it's not being articulated by people. I would hope so, just because it's one of the most basic questions the human being can ask. And if we're not asking it, then what's wrong? You mentioned how, like, we don't talk about God. I think that one of Judaism's unique oddities is that we don't talk about God much. Christians talk about God a lot, especially Protestants. And Muslims talk about God in fairly direct ways. Jews don't really talk about God because we have all of our sages. And we have the giant compendium of Jewish laws and commentaries and poems. We talk about what did Rashbam do, what Maimonides say, whatever. We don't talk about God. And I think that is a hole in the heart of the Jewish soul that needs to be filled. And we're not going to be the people we're supposed to be. And I mean like capital P people, until we begin to wrestle with that in a more direct way. I'm not sure how exactly that's going to happen, since talking about God is kind of uncomfortable in Western civilization generally. But it's a real thing for people, whether they believe in God or not. That discussion is a real thing, and there's got to be a space created for it, because there's a space I think in the human heart that needs filling.
But if you were, I mean, just to push you, I guess, a little bit, and maybe this is highlighting a little bit of my discomfort with this topic. So for people that have relatively strong convictions, that could be easier. For people that are in this camp of just, maybe you want to believe very specific things, but like in general, they're in this, and this is not even necessarily where I live, but where most people live, this like postmodernist soup of like, who knows what's true at all, and somebody asks about God. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily want, if my kid is in, elementary school or high school or maybe even, college, fine, whatever. There's a little bit of maturity that's beyond that. But like for their rabbi, if they were to ask a rabbi and their rabbi to say like, I have no idea. Like I just literally have zero clue what is true or not, or, anything like that.
So the question of what is true and the question of like what is the nature of God or what are not the same exact question.
Okay, but then that's already no. I appreciate that, and that's why, maybe I'm just psychoanalyzing myself here. So you can, I don't know if you want me to lie down on my my couch while we do this, but if you bring up the wealth of Jewish topics, I mean, God is obviously very real in a Jewish sense because Jews have been writing and thinking about God for thousands of years. As you said, that might be different, not necessarily different, but it could theoretically be different than the cosmological physics-based question of like, what has God done in history? Did God create the world? All of that. So that's why if you come to me as a student and you say, how can God allow this to happen? My gut reaction isn't actually sometimes God punishes the righteous because he wants more prayers, right? That's one of the answers the Talmud gives. Not a very compelling one, but the Talmud gives 12 different answers to this question. That's always one that, you probably shouldn't ever say to somebody, right? But that is an answer, right? So me, rather than say, well, here's the answer, it's this, look at, this source, or, here's my answer, you say, okay, listen, this is a question that, it almost gives me some comfort to think, hey, for 3,000 years, we've been asking ourselves these questions, and here are some of the answers. And here's, Maimonides, not the Stoic philosopher that wrote a bunch of long books that you've seen in synagogue and have never picked up, but like Maimonides, Moshe ben Maimon, the Spanish-born sage whose brother died in a freak accident at sea when Rambam, Maimonides, was just a teenager, who obviously reflected a lot about why bad things happen to good people. He was very close with his brother. He then has an answer that attempts to mitigate this. And other Jewish thinkers, the Kabbalistic tradition, who many of them were either themselves or the direct descendants of people whose families were decimated in the Iberian Peninsula, who then had to flee to the Ottoman Empire, who had really lost 400 years of, Jewish life in Spain. Here's what they answered that question. Like that gives it a lot more flavor in a way that doesn't feel inauthentic. I don't know if it works though, because again, at the end of the day, a student's going to say, well, I don't care about, as much as I can paint this in a very compelling way, which I think I can. I think it's fascinating intellectually to talk about this, and even a little bit, spiritually to talk about this history. If somebody's asking me the direct question, hey, my grandma died, how do I understand this theologically? Or, an even harder case, a sibling died, or, how do I understand this theologically? That's a really, really, really difficult question to answer, because I suspect if you were to say, well, they're in a better place now, they're in heaven, which, in some sense is the traditional answer. Obviously not the tradition, it's not full Christianity in the sense of that, but, the sort of traditional Jewish response, Baruch Dayan Emet, right? Blessed is the true judge. In other words, affirming, in some way God has made some judgment that is true and, maybe not good, but like this was, God has a plan, basically. You're affirming that, I don't know, people don't often think about it, but Baruch Dayan Emet is saying, don't worry, there's some plan here, that is at risk. So rather than extrapolating there, just saying, I'm so sorry, like I have no idea, but I'm here for you. Like I don't know, so I'm going to throw that back to
The
you.
student who comes to you with a loss, which happen, if you're a Hillel professional, this is something you have to deal with because it happens. They are You have to somehow know that student or assess that student and what they're looking for. And most of the time, they're looking for some kind of comfort, and you have to be able to figure out what is the need of the person that's in front of you. And do they need an authentic but simplistic answer? Sometimes. Do they need an authentic, unsatisfying answer that leaves those questions hanging? For some students, yeah, actually that is important. Or are they the student who needs to know that you're part of a people and a tradition that has wrestled with this impossible issue for thousands of years? We've talked about it in these different ways. We don't have an answer, but we have a conversation across millennia, and you're a part of it. You have to know
So
what
that is the individualized 100%. I'm with you. I think you should write that in a field book. I'm not saying this facetiously, and send it out, because that is the perfect way to think about it. In a general sense, though, something terrible happens, a terrorist attack, the Bebas boys, you discovered that they were strangled to death, last November, which we all found out, right before Shabbat, really. Something like that happens, and then you're addressing it publicly, to 100 different people who all are different on the spectrum. You have some people who would say, well, I don't believe in God anyway. Other people that, whatever the Torah, says, they believe in everything in between. That's where I feel like you are totally right, in the sense where there is a shying away from, explicit God talk there, because it's very hard to do that on a non-personal way. And so I have seen in a lot of liberal synagogues, and I do this too, explicitly shying away from things like, don't worry, God has a plan, or God does this, or, even to the extent where, and maybe this is bad, maybe, I'll have to reanalyze how I do this, but I've noticed if I'm giving like a drash/sermon or a Devar Torah on Shabbat, and I'll, oftentimes I'll default to, God says to, and then God said to Abraham, but sometimes I'll even say, well, the Torah describes how God talked to Abraham, right? There's two very different ways of putting it. One is sort of affirming this as, statement, and the other is almost approaching the Torah as, this is our literary heritage. And in that book, it describes this. And so I think oftentimes I do default to the second of, oh, Maimonides says this, or the Torah describes this, as opposed to, no, God said that he will do this and blah, blah, blah.
I think that's a fair way to do it for people who don't have a belief in the like a firm belief in the existence and activity of God in their lives. To say, I often use that language, right? Well, our tradition says, or the Torah says in this, whatever. I think that's legit, but it puts God into the conversation, and then the conversation becomes, well, what did God mean when the Torah says he said this to Abraham? And we need more of that in our conversations. And we need to be able to, like, I think Orthodox Jews have a similar problem sometimes to very liberal Jews. They think you're not allowed to be mad at God or argue with God. Like, because I know in the modern Orthodox community, there's sort of of which I am a part, there's kind of like an agreement. We all believe in this certain framework of things, and we're going to work within that framework, and we're not going to question it. So that on Thursday night last week, when we had just found out that the Bibas children had been murdered, and the horrible way in which it happened, and then Shiri Bibas they send the fake Alsamal's body, and all that pain that came from that. That same night, the bus bombs were discovered, and a massive, what we now believe is a massive terrorist attack, which involved many, many more buses and places, and together with terrorist attacks coming out of some of the cities of the Shomron, that was averted. And Thursday night, my particular community and social media timeline was filled with people saying, Baruch Hashem, Hashem saved us, the miracles, it's incredible. And on the one hand, I'm like, yeah, thank God, Baruch Hashem, that a miracle happened and this one person saw something on the bus and that led to saving of hundreds, if not thousands of lives. And on the other hand, how can I say, oh, thank you for the miracle, God, of saving our lives here? At the same moment, I'm holding the butchering of a toddler and an infant and their mother in my other hand, that God did allow to happen. There needs to be a space for that conversation. Orthodox Jews don't like to have that conversation because it's a criticizing God, and like that's not nice. We should be more subservient in some fashion. And I find sometimes liberal Jews who take God, they think you're not allowed to as a Jew to be critical of God. You can say I don't believe in that, but you can't argue with him. And arguing with God is like our basic thing. In the end, we have respect, and there is a tradition of subservience to God's will, but we also have a tradition of arguing and sometimes being really angry. And that's like a tradition that is legit. And in this moment, I think people can even find comfort in.
Yeah, I really love that. And I think it just goes full circle with, everything we've talked about. We can attempt to neatly wrap this up in a bow. I don't know if I'll be successful here. This has been good. A nice hour and a half, I think, conversation. When you appreciate a more thick Judaism that, has room for all these things, there's also room for God, and then also room for criticizing God, all within that thickness, that if you're Jewish, level is very thin, a lot of times it feels like you can't even broach the topic because, you don't realize you can criticize God. You don't have the wealth of background in terms of understanding that Jewish history is a bunch of people trying to wrestle with God and understand God. And so, again, hopefully this is a push, and, hopefully the sociology in the next couple of years very much pushes a lot of the liberal Jewish community to sort of wake up to the fact that I think a lot of these problems could be solved with sort of a doubling down on Judaism, not other things. The last thing I will say, this is the last thing, unless you say something that goads me, but I will give you the final word. So it's always a risk that I'll be motivated to respond here. is that one of the funny things that I've always been uncomfortable with in Hillel, and Hillel in some way has moved away from this in the last couple of years, but I remember a couple of years ago, the buzzword that you had to write on every single grant and everything was innovation. And it was, how are we going to innovate Shabbat? And how are we going to innovate Torah learning? And how are we going to, and I remember reading this, when I first got to Hillel and thinking like, Shabbat's worked pretty well for 3,000 years for the Jewish people. I mean, obviously there's been, okay, Kabbalat Shabbat, we can say was an innovation in the, 1600s in Tzfat, fine. I will give that. But for the most part, like Shabbat's worked. We haven't need innovation. We don't need every Hillel professional on every different campus thinking about new ways to innovate Shabbat. Let's just have Shabbat. And I think it goes into a lot of these conversations of like, can we just have Judaism and Jewish tradition and all of these without also feeling the need to say Judaism and reproductive rights, Judaism and, the Super Bowl, Judaism and, all these things, because I think that does allude to a thinness of saying, well, we don't really know if we can handle just the Judaism, so we're going to buttress it with this other thing that I can talk about a lot. So I can, a lot of Hillel professionals could talk for an hour about reproductive rights and wrap in, a couple of vague Jewish values and real Jewish values, but like shallow Jewish values that are actual values, but, just kind of, general verses that they cherry pick from places. But how many people can talk for an hour about Shabbat, like just about Shabbat, nothing else, like the value of Shabbat, what it's meant for Jews, the laws of Shabbat, the philosophy. And so I think that push is something that might make people feel uncomfortable initially, but I think once you dive in there, you realize just how important that is.
That push will make the liberal educator more uncomfortable than it will make the liberal listener, who is probably only in that Jewish space to learn something more Jewish. And we need to be more comfortable with that. It just to wrap it all up, and again, all the questions that we've asked here are questions people have been asking for most of our history, right? And some of the answers are the same answers, like, because as you read in like my favorite book of our tradition, Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, traditionally attributed to King Solomon. There's nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new. These are all questions Jews have been asking and worrying about and wrestling with and arguing with each other about for all of our history. And there's something very comforting to know that we're part of that story in the deepest, most authentic manner, just in the worries that we have and the concerns that we have and the hopes and that we have. And we will continue this conversation for generations to come.
Sounds great. Well, Andrew, thank you as always.
Thanks, Daniel. This was a lot of fun. Really appreciate it. And Mazel Tov again.
Thank you, my friend.